Hi, welcome to GATS 5063. This is week 4. I'm going to talk to you about targeting and strategizing the church plant. And so by now you guys are full on into this here. We're about almost halfway through the course. And so this week for your reading assignments, you had Stetzer and Im's book, Planting Missional Churches, chapter 7, 8, and 9. And I want to talk just for a moment a couple concepts in chapter 8, briefly mention chapter 9, and then as well with the Global Church Planting book of Ott and Wilson, you had chapter 6, The Shape of the Church, chapter 7, Pioneer Reproduction and Approaches to Church Planting. So I'm not going to cover all of that, just cover a few things. I have a few of my own notes I want to go over on targeting and strategizing the church plants. So let me first mention Stetzer and Im's book, Planting Missional Churches, and we're going to take a look here at chapter 8. Chapter 8 is a thought-provoking, a little bit of a challenging chapter titled Multi-Ethnic or Monoethnic Churches. And he starts out reminding us of a statement that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in 1963. He looked at the landscape of churches in America and shared how that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the nation. He called it tragic, and most of us would agree. They go on here and mention recent research by Lifeway. Research says that Sunday morning remains one of the most segregated hours in American life, with more than 8 in 10 congregations made up of one predominant racial group. They also discovered that 2/3 of American churchgoers, 67%, say their church has done enough to become racially diverse, and less than half think their church should become more diverse. And so that's a challenging chapter that is well worth you looking at, especially as we're talking about targeting and strategizing, getting ready to develop a church planting plan, because we need to begin to look at who are you trying to reach. I'm going to get a lot into demographics, looking at your culture, contextualization. We'll talk about that here in a moment. Who are you trying to reach? What the culture, people in the culture, and the strategy around that. And so obviously, race is part of that factor. And so you've got to ask yourself, are you targeting one specific group of people? For example, I know that here in town we have, I believe, one or more, I've lost track now, Korean churches, for example. So they're a mono-ethnic church culture, specifically trying to reach those of Korean heritage, and so in that particular sense, it works well. They're a small minority community here, and they're able to talk, in Korean language, etc. And so it works well for them. And we have some other churches, similar type situation, Vietnamese, etc. But in a broad stroke, I would submit to you, I'm going to talk about this more in regards to my own experience planning Passion Church here in Tucson. I think a multi-ethnic approach is generally the better approach, unless the Lord has specifically told you to target a specific group of people or racial group. So it's a very good chapter, really worth taking a look at and really considering when it comes to thinking about your strategy and targeting who you're going to reach. He gives the example on page 103 of the first multi-ethnic church. Very interesting historical reading about the Antioch church and how there was actually some racial problems there. It was a very racially diverse city, but the church itself did not allow racial hatred or racism affect who they were as a congregation. And so it's really worthwhile seeing. And one other thing I thought was interesting on page 105, U.S. Census Bureau projects that by the year 2043, there'll be no clear majority population. So that said, here in America, in terms of church planting and church planting here in another generation, we certainly need to be thinking about multi-ethnic type congregations. So anyway, some good reading here in these chapters. He also talks about multi-site. Let me just jump over there real quick. Multi-site, churches. That's become a big thing where you have a mother church, then you have some like satellite type churches. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but that is another form of church planting where you have a large church that now is trying to reach either different quadrants of a large metropolitan area or maybe other cities and just outside of the large urban area. So you'll have, and usually this rallies around a church with a solid structure, a good speaking pastor or speaking team, and so what these multi-site type churches that start up usually do, they usually have their own worship, and then they live stream in that teaching pastor or that teaching team, but then they have a leadership team there at the site campus, to minister to the people and to help pastor the people. And so that is another form of church planting that has become very popular. So they devote a whole chapter to that. And so that's worth looking at, this multi-site or campus type structure. So again, some good reading there. And again, some of you watching or part of the class, you might be involved in some of that already. So some good stuff there. Also, in the Global Church Planting book with Ott and Wilson, I want to take a few minutes and spend some time there in chapter 6. He talks about the shape of the church. And he states on page 107, the purpose of this chapter is to help church planters select a basic church shape and work with local believers to contextualize church structures and ministries. So the whole chapter really is developed, is around this idea of shaping the church or contextualizing the church structure. He talks a little bit on page 108 about the task of shaping the church, and he makes a very important statement here, paragraph. The scriptures give broad guidelines regarding certain aspects of church organization, but few details are normative. For example, you won't find anything in the Gospels or the New Testament about how to run a Sunday service, how to have a children's ministry, youth ministry, etc., outreach. We just see some very broad guidelines. Go into all the world, make disciples of all the nations. We're to evangelize, make disciples. But in terms of how we do that, it's very broad. And I'll add to that, even church government, in terms of how we legally structure churches, even that it's kind of very vague. I mean, Paul talks about appointing those who leadership functions, elders, deacons, or those overseeing leaders, or those servant leaders. It might be a better way to look at it. But there's very, very little discussion in terms of how to set up a 501c3 corporation. Obviously, that's a modern concept. Nonprofit church organization, etc. So he quotes here. He says, "While there is no one right or final way to shape the church, this does not mean that shape is incidental or irrelevant. Form and content are intimately bound together. The medium is the message. The structure of the church is the visible and tangible expression of its faith and witness." So structure is important. Jesus talked about, if you want to have new wine, you need a new wineskin. You've got to have structure. You've got to have something contain this essence of the Spirit. The Spirit gives life to the body. We give our lives to Christ. We're baptized by the Spirit, by one Spirit, into the body of Christ. And so, therefore, the Holy Spirit in community is the vital element, or the essence of God knitting us all together. And so we need structure then for community to develop and for the purposes that God has, for a local church body to unfold. He goes on to say in the bottom of page 108, choices made by planners will have significant impact on church establishment, growth, health, and reproduction. And the patterns that are set early in the life of the church become very difficult to change later. For example, there are some churches that take a very strict view, a very literal view of the scriptures in terms of women in key leadership roles, or women called to be pastors or overseers of a church. And so there are some churches that form, again, taking that very literal view of the New Testament, where women aren't allowed to have key leadership positions. And so it's not my purpose here to really debate that. But that said, if in the early days of your church establishment, that is a key value, that women can't have a place of ministry, then that's going to affect the culture of the church years to come. And all of a sudden, if there's a group of leaders 10 or 15 years later, or 5 years, whatever the case may be, to want to change that paradigm and to say, wait a minute, we see this differently, that women do have a place in ministry, et cetera, that's a key piece of it. And by the way, I'm very much in favor of women in ministry. So that's just one example. But then in terms of style of worship, contemporary worship, are we casual dress, are we, you can all kinds of form and function. Do the children stay in with us during the worship, or do the children go into a separate place? Again, there's no right or wrong on many of these types of things. It's got to do with the culture and the contextualization that comes out of the culture. And so this is a very, very important chapter, and he talks about critical reflections needed on page 109, one size does not fit all. Then on page 110, multiple influences in shape. The term shaping should not give the impression that church planners, like potters, can imagine a final product, put their hands to the wheel, and fashion the church as they would a vase. Many influences come to bear in decisions regarding church structure. God's leading. Obviously, we're praying. We're asking for the Holy Spirit's leading in this church plant. The influence of other churches, whether it's a mother church, sponsored church, etc. The ideas of church planters. Again, the unique gifting and mandate calling of each individual church planter or church planting team. Uncontrollable outside factors, persecution, resources. I thought that was an interesting statement, but that's certainly a factor there. And the aspirations of the new community itself. For example, when we planted our church, some of the first ones that really rallied around us that were interested in a church plant were folks that had left some more traditional churches, weren't meeting anywhere, just kind of having some home meetings. They heard we were new to town. They heard we were looking at possibly planting and establishing a church after we'd been here for a little bit. And so some of them began to talk to us how they had a vision to be part of something to plant a church, specifically around the move of the Spirit that happened again in 1994 out of Toronto, the renewal movement, of course, of which Randy Clark, our overseer, Global Awakening, was a catalyst for that there in the Arnott's Church in Toronto. And so my wife and I had been part of what had been there early in 94, early on in that move of God, and so that was very much part of who we were. We'd also been affiliated some with vineyard churches, etc. There in Florida where we were, and so this was very much our heart and some of our DNA. And so with this group that we had met, we were really longing for a church, a community where the move of the Spirit, the renewal element of the Spirit, and giving liberty to that as well. They wanted some structure, but they wanted that. Whereas the churches they had been a part of, where they've kind of were disenfranchised, had kind of shut down the renewal movement, and not only shut it down, even in separate meetings outside of the regular Sunday morning service, they were very negative towards it. And so that statement, what is the aspirations of the community or the group of people that God's called you to? What are they looking for? And again, that's just another one of many examples as you get into places, what the folks are looking for. He talks about some different types of churches. Page 112, selecting a basic church shape. He talks about house churches, voluntary gathered congregations, and then cell celebration churches, which is more like our type of church, at least our church here in Tucson is. Then he gives some really good case study on this. Then on page 119, that's an important point. You even got a question 19 this week, on contextualizing structures and ministries. So you want to really look at that closely. This is how to determine the more specific church structures and ministries is really part of the larger question of how to appropriately contextualize the church in a particular cultural setting, right? And so you've got to really take a look at this. And he explains what contextualization is. Then he offers a following three-step process to go through the process of contextualization. So take a close look at that. Then on the next page, table 6.2, so this is page 120, this is excellent. He gives contextualization of church-shaped structures and ministries, and you define the biblical purposes. So obviously we all want worship in our churches, evangelism and mission, teaching and edification, service and community impact, fellowship, governance, and leadership. So these are all key areas that are going to make up the shape or the essence of who your church is, or what or the community of believers that are going to gather to form this local congregation. And so now he begins to break it down into studying cultural forms and ask some really good questions and make some very good statements, and then how to implement those contextualized structures and practices. So that is very well worth taking a look at and looking at closely, especially for those of you that are in the class that are seriously looking at church planning, or you see that on the horizon. There's a wealth of information there. So I'll let you go through that. That'll help you there with question 19 as well this week. So let's talk about some of my notes on targeting and strategizing the church plant. And so, again, we talked a lot about last week about the team, recruiting a team, developing a team. I'll get into, by the way, some in next week in week 5 about developing your vision statement, talk a little bit about that, and begin to look a little more closely at developing your plan. So this is sort of the intro to getting you going on developing your vision statement. I don't believe you can really develop a vision statement or begin to develop your plan for your church plant when you haven't really looked carefully at the geographical and demographic aspects of the culture. Again, this whole idea of contextualization that is so important. So if you haven't done so, you need to carefully think through who it is you are targeting and with this new church. So choosing a target means, at a basic level, not only identifying where it is you want to plant a church, the geographic area that you feel God's calling you to, or where you're at currently, but it means planning with a sense of clarity about who within that particular area you feel called and equipped to reach. For example, are they working class, blue collar folks, middle class? Are they the poor? Maybe you're called to minister to the poor, or maybe those on the streets, the homeless. Another question is, what age group or demographic of people, or maybe you feel called to a college ministry, or to plant a college type church. So obviously that demographic is going to be totally different than planting a church in a suburban area or the inner city where you are ministering to more of the poor, or let's say the homeless. So you really do need to know the target group that you feel the Lord is leading you to. So you've got this calling, but who is he calling you to? Who has he called you to reach? And so you need to be able to answer those questions. So choosing a target group means to disavow this kind of random or shotgun approach, aiming at anything and everything. And that can have some level of effectiveness, but it's much more effective if you can hone in, again, much prayer, much conversation with your church planning associates or team, if you have one, or if it's just you and your spouse, to really pray through this and kind of get a heartbeat for who the Lord's leading you to. So it means reconciling yourself to the fact that issues of culture, education, style, values, and ethnicity will, whether you like it or not, have great bearing on who will come to your church. So for example, here in Tucson, we have a large Hispanic community, and from the very beginning, we knew that at some point in time we wanted to have an impact in the Hispanic community. But my wife and I are both, from the central and northeastern part of the United States. We're white Caucasian, and so we don't speak Spanish other than just a few words. And which was a question I had for the Lord, more than once here when we first got to Tucson, feeling called to plant a church here. And I'm like, well, Lord, I don't even speak Spanish very well. But we began to realize that, and he began to show us in words and prophetically, that we were to plant a more multi-ethnic congregation. Those who were from, both Hispanic backgrounds, Caucasian, African American, Asian, etc. And then within that, as the Lord would unfold it, begin to believe him to reach maybe more into the Hispanic community. And again, we're still in some cases still in some of the beginning stages of some of that. We've looked over the years at different things, whether we should have a separate Spanish service. There's some pros and cons with that, which is part of the reason we haven't moved on it, because there can be some more negatives than pros in some cases. So again, what we have found for us and what our calling was to be multi-ethnic. Now, it is interesting that a large part of the Hispanic community here in Tucson, and by the way, as you get more into the south side of Tucson, it's more 60% Hispanic, 40% Caucasian or other minorities. And so a large percentage of that Hispanic congregation is Catholic. So in my particular background, I was raised Catholic, and actually still have a heart for the Catholic Church. I gave my life to Christ when I was 20, and then gradually began to move away from Catholicism and begin to fellowship in non-denominational charismatic churches. But I understand Catholicism. I always joke to everybody, I say, I'm in good standing with the Pope. I wasn't excommunicated, When I was 13, I went through confirmation. They make you kiss the bishop's ring and all that kind of stuff. And so whatever your feelings are about Catholics, which, by the way, I hope you don't have negative feelings. It's one body of Christ, right? We need to understand that that's a big component in a lot of our cities. There are a lot of Catholics. And so a lot of times Protestants tend to ignore them, or they ignore the reality that some of the folks coming into their church were former Catholics. So guess what's happened over time? We have a lot of Hispanics in our church. In fact, I looked up on our worship team last Sunday, and I counted, and it was like, okay, we got 9 members up on the worship team. 5 of them are Hispanic. I thought that was really interesting. So in that respect, a lot of the inroad in the Hispanic community has happened in many of our churches, and many of them are former Catholics. Well, not only Hispanics, but now over time, we have Caucasians that are former Catholics that are in our church, as well as those that have come out of evangelical background that want more of the Spirit. So again, you need to understand, who is it you're called to reach, and who are you equipped to reach, okay? So now a logical question is, how do you go about determining your target group? Here are some guidelines that might help you. Number one, know who you can reach best. Pretty simple, but it's an important thing to understand. It goes back a couple lessons ago, kind of understanding the makeup of who you are, your DNA, your design as a church planner or church planning team. The gospel primarily spreads through relationships. Therefore, it makes sense to go after those you are most likely to reach, people who are like you, okay? So people whose background and cultural style is similar to yours, you're going to have a higher percentage and a greater probability of reaching them. Studies have shown that the number one reason people initially choose a church is because they identify with the pastor, their design, their cultural background, their makeup, their mannerisms, right? So while the pastor does not attract first-time visitors, he is, or she is, a major reason that people come back to the church. So therefore, as a pastor, you should be able to honestly and accurately answer these kinds of questions about yourself. What kind of person am I? What is my cultural background? Again, I just shared, there a minute ago with you, white Caucasian, raised Catholic. So those were all factors in sort of my background. And oh, by the way, here's another factor. Went into the military, I was in the Navy right out of high school. That's where I came to Christ, by the way. Then I earned a bachelor's degree while I was in the Navy in electrical engineering. Got out of the Navy, began to work as an electrical engineer for a while. That's where Carol and I met. She was a software engineer. And so our early formative years in our 20s were in a professional environment working in DoD aerospace engineering. And so that's kind of our our background before we felt the call of God later, after we got married. And then I was 30, she was about 28 when we got married, and then it was just a year or two later we were baptized with the Spirit, and we felt the call of God to ministry, and specifically in missions. And so that sort of began our journey. And so then when we got here to Tucson, years later, I was age 41 when we planted the church here. And so guess what? For her and I, it was naturally easy to begin to identify with other young or middle-aged people who are more of a professional background, that type of thing. Even though, again, we didn't set out just to plant a suburban church. In fact, where the church is now is more in the center of town. But what's happened over time, we've attracted a lot of more professional people, engineers, accountants, business people, doctors, etc., those kind of folks, as well as a lot of working class people. As time went on, more and more working class people, and more of a poor congregation, and very racially diverse, which has been wonderful. And so I'm saying all that to say, I have never felt called. There's another pastor in town, his particular church. I love him. He rides a Harley. He's totally into the whole Harley thing. I have nothing against Harleys or motorcycles. I have nothing against tattoos, but he's tattooed, quite a bit. Harley, he's a little rough. He gives that a rough appearance. Actually, he's real gentle, and but he naturally now reaches out to those obviously in the biker community, but as well as folks that have, I call them kind of streetwise. Maybe they've had different addictions, some have come out of prostitution, etc. So a lot of the makeup and the demographic of his church is more in that respect. And so they naturally identify with him, whereas someone like me, they may not identify, as much with me, and vice versa. He may not have an engineer or somebody come into his church and maybe be able to quite identify with him. So you really got to kind of know who who you are as a person, your cultural background, your upbringing, your educational background, your life experience, etc. All of that comes into play, and so that's just one thing. So for many pastors, they experience frustration or failure because at the root, they really don't know who they are. Who am I? Who am I called? That's why that Destiny Finder tool is really good. And again, we looked at some of the church planning assessment tools. All of those might be good. But the more that you can understand who you are, what your calling is, what God has spoke to you, and your makeup, that's going to help you on this. So it's really crucial to sure you're not unconsciously trying to be something you're not. For example, if you're not an intellectual, don't try to be, right? And therefore don't try planning a church, an intellectual hub of some big university town or whatever. On the other hand, if you're white, middle class, think twice before going after the blue collar workers or the poor in the south side of town, or like I just gave the example of my pastor friend, that might be trying to reach out to the biker community or those coming off the streets, that type of thing, right? So you just got to really kind of know who you are and who you're called to. So you need to do a frank self-analysis. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with your church planning team. Get others who are close to you to give you honest feedback. And again, unless you have a missionary call, people are usually called to reach those most like themselves, right? So there are times, whether you're an urban missionary or a missionary in a foreign country, where you are specifically called to those of not the same cultural background as you. That does happen, and God will give a grace for that if that's truly your calling, but you'll know it, right? And so if you're not sure of that, then generally you're going to most likely reach and minister to those who are most similar to you. And again, remember, even missionary callings invariably work down the socio-economic ladder, not up. It's an extremely rare person who can successfully minister to people whose social class is significantly higher than his or her own. And that's sort of just a leadership principle. And so the more training, education, and leadership experience you have, generally, you're going to be able to minister to those of equal or lesser, if you will, on those type of situations. But it's going to be very, very hard to try to reach those that are in a different class, unless you're specifically called that. And that does happen, but again, it's rare. Specific questions to ask of your target area. Number 2, So once you are clear on who you are and who you can naturally reach best, then you can think about your target more specifically based on the area in which you feel called to plant. So consider your target demographically. This simply means you identify where people live and socialize that you want to reach. Now, you want to obtain demographic information on your area. You can Google U.S. Census, data on your city or the area in which you live, and so you can get a lot of information. Another organization that you can, I believe there's a cost with it, but it's the Percept group in Costa Mesa, California. Their website is Percept, PerceptGroup.com, and they can provide a lot of really good information demographically on your area. And so here are some most important factors you may want to find out: the age of the folks that you're trying to reach in that demographic area. Marital status can provide percentages of married homes versus single family homes, and believe that's a factor as well. I mean, we live right now presently in America where 25% of the children being raised in America are raised in a single family home. A large majority of those are single mothers, in some cases single fathers, but that's a factor. If you're more in a inner city type environment, or you may have a lot of single mothers, and so that's a factor in terms of how you minister and how you reach them. Income. What is the median and average household income? While that's a factor in the sense that how you relate to the people, again, oftentimes it relates to education. Obviously, the more education a person has, generally the more income that they make, and so all of those are factors there. But it also can be a factor in terms of the church planning. You're trying to plant this church, and you're relying on offerings and givings, unless you've been sent out by a mother church that's, I've known some pastors that, they've been sent out and, given 6 months salary from the mother church, and a couple hundred people, 100 people or whatever, sent with them. And of course, we'll get into that a little bit more next week as well. I've mentioned it before, but that's, hiving off or sending out. And so you're set up a little better. But if you're doing more of an apostolic missionary plant, for example, like my wife and I did here in Tucson, and you don't have a sending organization, sending church, then you're really sort of dependent on either your tent making skills, the income that you can make as you're getting that church started, or you're depending on attracting those that believe in the vision, but they also have the ways and means to help fund the vision. And so these are all very real aspects about it. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week in terms of at what point you should start having public meetings and that type of thing. There's different philosophies on that, and at what point a pastor should start taking a salary. And, again, all of these are factors. I'll just give you a little clue. Usually it's around 70 to 80 people is a good number. When you have that many people that are committed, usually at that point a pastor can maybe start taking a salary. But again, there may be different situations. You just need to follow the leading of the Lord. So some other demographic information that's important. So we talked about age, marital status, income, education. Just mentioned that quite a bit in that with the income discussion. Occupation, all related. What types of work are predominant? Again, are you reaching more white collar professional folks, or are you reaching more blue collar type folks in an area? Again, all of these come into play in terms of the types of ministry that you're going to do and the culture, the community. Again, remember, you want to contextualize that group of people that you're trying to reach and minister to, and the things that are going to interest them, that are going to minister to them, that are going to keep them involved, that are going to want them to, they're excited about the church and they're going to want to invite their friends or family, etc. So you need to consider, again, your target culturally. So I can't stress that enough. The best way to find out the culture, the mindset, and the lifestyle of people is to talk to them personally. Here's a good example. Now this happened to us just last year. So this was, year 16 of our church last year. And so we had felt for some time, so actually began in year 15, that maybe we needed to have, in addition to our Sunday morning service, a Saturday night service. So we spent our staff, our leadership team praying, going over information, coming up with a plan, really evaluating it for nearly 6 months before we tried launching a Saturday night service last year. And no matter how much research we did, talking to some other pastors who had Saturday night services, guess what we found out? The culture here in Tucson doesn't want to go to church on Saturday night. And so I thought we did our homework. I thought we really studied the demographics, talked to other pastors, et cetera. And there is just culturally where our city is at, where the folks are at, they don't want to go to church on Saturday night. Now, even on Sunday morning, we have a low percentage. It's somewhere around 7% of the population attends church on Sunday morning. So, but in the church community, by and large, didn't want to go to church on Saturday night. Now, a lot of them don't mind maybe a home meeting on Saturday night, but in terms of having weekly Saturday night church services, our culture here, the demographic here in this city, tends to shy away from it. Now, your city might be totally different. For example, some of you have been on Global Awakening trips, mission trips, you've been down to Brazil, for example. Brazil's an example of, in that society, their big Sunday service isn't Sunday morning, it's Sunday evening. Now, a lot of those churches do have a Sunday morning, but the big service is generally Sunday, late afternoon or evening. That's when they have their big service. Again, it's got to do with the culture. So you need to understand the culture, how the patterns of the people, their likes, their dislikes, and that's even within the Christian community. So you might want to consider taking your own survey of people, both those in the church community, those outside of the church community. Ask them what they feel are their greatest needs. Obviously, it goes beyond when to have a church service, but that may come into play. What are their values? What are their interests? What are their hurts? What are their fears? You have a lot of unchurched people who maybe they have had some church experience, but they see the church and they paint it's a broad brushed opinion or judgment. They see the church as mean-spirited, uncaring, unloving. A good book on that is a book that Gary Kinnaman wrote a few years ago called Unchristian. It's an eye-opening book on how much most of society takes a look at the church. They see as mean-spirited, hypocritical, judgmental, these type of things. And so, how do the people in your area that you're trying to reach, how do they view the church? And so you need to be, open to receiving both the positive and negative as you're trying to form and contextualize and determine your target culturally. So what are the subcultures or subgroups? These are important things, take a look at. What are subgroups in the different age groups, for example, millennials, et cetera, et cetera. So define your target spiritually. Interview other pastors in the area. Again, as a church planter, if you can build some good relationships with some other pastors in the area, and generally most pastors are not territorial, especially if they're kingdom-minded. You may have some that are a little, untrusting, but if you can build some relationships and share your heart and who you're trying to reach, and especially if you can alleviate any fears from them that you're going to be trying to pull under people, as I shared last week. You're not going to try to recruit people out of their church or worship team members out of their church, etc. These are all things that are really important. So, so that's an important thing. So what, again, I mentioned religious background a minute ago. What is the religious background of the people? Are they, like I mentioned, we found ourselves among a lot of former Catholics, but you might be in the Bible Belt, and there might be a lot of Southern Baptists in that Bible Belt. Excuse me. Or maybe you're up in more of the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. Maybe it's more of a Lutheran background. So you really need to kind of just know or in our case in Arizona, we also have a lot of Arizona and Utah, a lot of Mormons, and so understanding that we have a lot of ex-Mormons, by the way. I wouldn't say a lot, but we have a percentage in our church. So, or are you trying to reach unbelievers with little Christian understanding? So, again, just all of these things are questions for trying to come up with your demographic and understand your cultural target. Perhaps you're trying to gather Christians who are unchurched, disconnected from the body of Christ. Again, I mentioned, some of the folks after the Toronto renewal there in 1994, and as we were in Tucson, a lot of these people, kind of being unchurched or not connected anymore, and yet they had a great hunger for more of the Lord. It was a really interesting dynamic, a real hunger for more of the Lord, but the status quo in terms of church and church services they weren't interested in. They wanted something new and refreshing and spirit-led. What other churches or new church plants are in your area? That's a demographic as well. It would be very foolish to go into a growing area of your city and there's 3 other church plants right there. Unless you feel very called and the Lord has directed you very specifically. Now, I will add that you may be called to like a growing area, and maybe there are some other church plants, but your style and flavor of church, i.e. more of a spirit-led church, etc., is so different than those other churches. Let's say they're more evangelical, then that's a different scenario. Then there may be a good fit. So you might want to really take a look at who there is in your area and what's happening there. Now, in identifying, this is important, in identifying people you want to reach, remember that there are 2 groups of people who are especially receptive to the gospel whenever you're trying to reach new folks. And this is whether you're church planting or not, but this is true. Number 1, people in transition. So, for example, maybe they have a new marriage, a new baby, a new job, new home, new school, or just relocated to your city. These are folks that are in transition. So people that have just relocated to your city, oftentimes, they are looking for a new church and might want to be part of, a church plant. So you really need to take a look at it. Now, I find it interesting, but those who are newly married oftentimes are very interested in getting involved in church culture. Those that are new parents with babies, it's interesting to me how many of them all of a sudden really want to get connected to church. I guess that's because they figured out there's no owner's manual when you get a child, right? So all of a sudden faith and community becomes a big part of it. So people in transition. So those may be some of the folks that you want to think of ways that you can reach them and target them. How would you try to target some of those folks? A second group of people are people under tension. And this you need to be very tender with, but those maybe have been through divorce, death, unemployment, financial problems, or they're just lonely or even depressed. So people under tension, oftentimes they're looking for the solace and comfort of community and the Lord and church. So obviously that's another group. So these are folks and groups of people within maybe a respective demographic group that you can consider try to reach as you're thinking about how to evangelize and how to reach new people in an area. So that's what I have for this week on targeting and strategizing. I hope that's beneficial. The reading will give you a lot. I think if you'll just do a little bit of internet research, whether just through doing online research, Google, whatever, on terms of demographics, but begin to think about next week you're going to begin to pull together an outline for a church plan, so it's not too early to begin to really begin to take a look at that, begin to think about who's the target area, what's the geographic area, who am I called to reach, what's my background, my style. Again, for some of you, this is just part of the course and you're not actually going to be planning a church. But for some of you, this actually may be very applicable. So my sincere hope, and the reason I designed the course this way, is so it would give you something very practical and useful in church planning. So take care and best to you on your studies here.